What happens when one of the most brutal warriors in fiction is thrown into the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40K universe? Battle Beast has arrived, and he isn't looking for allies, territory, or survival. He wants the strongest warriors in the galaxy. From Necrons to Chaos Space Marines, every battle is just another opportunity to prove his strength. But in a universe where there is only war, will Battle Beast finally find an opponent strong enough to satisfy his bloodlust? Watch until the end to find out, and subscribe for more epic crossover stories. The galaxy did not scream when Thok arrived. It simply groaned under the weight of a new, apex violence. In the lightless subvaults of the Hive World Orestes, buried beneath kilometers of shifting industrial waste and the crumbling cathedrals of a forgotten era, a silence that had lasted 60 million years was shattered. It began with a flicker of emerald light, a hum of hyper-advanced circuitry failing as a Necron tesseract labyrinth, a relic of a civilization that had mastered the laws of physics only to find them wanting, detonated from the inside out. The containment field, designed to hold gods and Cetan shards, buckled. Reality itself seemed to bruise, turning a sickly shade of purple and black before snapping. Out of the wreckage stepped a figure that did not belong to the cold, clinical logic of the Necrons, nor the desperate, superstitious misery of the Imperium of Man. Battle Beast stood amidst the hyperdense alloy shards of his prison, his mane a snow-white thicket stained with the residual energy of the warp. He breathed in, and for the first time in an age, the air tasted of something beautiful. It tasted of burning promethium, decaying flesh, and the sharp, metallic tang of impending slaughter. He did not look for an exit. He did not seek an escape. He simply tightened his grip on his dual-headed maces, his eyes scanning the gloom for a heart to stop or a skull to crush. To Thok, the universe was not a place of politics, or gods, or destiny. It was a buffet of combat, and he had been starving for a very long time. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button, and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The vault was not empty. Sensing the breach, the tomb's automated defenses flickered to life. From the shadows, the mechanical clicking of Gauss flares echoed against the damp stone. Necron warriors, their metallic skeletal frames hunched and tireless, marched forward with the synchronized precision of a clockwork nightmare. Behind them, a Canoptech spider unfurled its multi-jointed limbs, its ocular sensors glowing with a baleful, unliving light. They did not speak. They did not challenge. They simply calculated the threat and moved to excise it. Battle Beast let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the very marrow of the world. "Steel in silence," he spat, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "You have no blood to spill, no spirit to break. You are a waste of my time." When the first Gauss beam hissed through the air, stripping the molecules from a nearby stone pillar, Thok didn't dodge. He moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk, a white blur of predatory instinct. He slammed into the front rank of Necron warriors like a falling moon. His maces didn't just strike the living metal, they pulverized it, sending shards of necrodermis flying across the chamber. He moved with a grace that was offensive to the mechanical logic of his foes, a whirlwind of fur and fury that bypassed their targeting sensors by sheer erratic violence. He tore the head from a warrior with his bare hands, feeling the cold, sparking wires snap beneath his grip, and tossed the useless husk aside. But the Necrons were a sea of silver. For every one he crushed, 3 more phased into existence. The Canoptech spider lunged, its fabricator claws snapping at his throat. Battle Beast caught the machine mid-air, his muscles bulging as he strained against its hydraulic power. With a roar of genuine frustration, he wrenched the machine apart, oil spraying across his face like black ichor. Yet, as he looked around at the rising tide of metal, his heart didn't race with excitement. It sagged. This was not a fight, it was a chore. It was like fighting the wind or a mountain. There was no glory in breaking a machine that felt no fear. High above the vault, the world of Orestes was experiencing a different kind of ending. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, as the great rift tore through the firmament. Chaos had come. The Black Legion, led by the Butcher Lord Harkin World Eater, had descended upon the Hive World to harvest souls for the War Master's eternal campaign. Orbital bombardments leveled spires that had stood for 10 millennia, and the air was thick with the screams of millions. As the Necron vault was breached from within by Thok, it was simultaneously breached from above by a Black Legion boarding pod. The ceiling of the tomb buckled and exploded inward in a shower of reinforced ferro-concrete. Out of the dust stepped the giants of the 41st millennium, Chaos Space Marines. Their power armor was a jagged mosaic of black and gold, adorned with the flayed skins of Imperial defenders and the blasphemous iconography of the Warp. They moved with a predatory confidence, their bolters barking like thunder, spitting explosive rounds that tore through the Necron ranks. At their head was a Chaos Champion of Khorne, a monster clad in crimson-stained plate, wielding a chain axe that sang a high-pitched screaming song of thirst. He saw the Necrons and laughed, a sound of pure madness. But then, his gaze shifted. He saw the white-maned Titan standing atop a pile of shattered silver limbs. He saw Battle Beast. Thok froze. He felt it. A sudden sharp spike in the atmosphere. These new arrivals weren't machines. He could smell the sweat beneath their armor, the adrenaline flooding their systems, and most importantly, the dark, psychic rot of their souls. They were warriors. They were killers. They were alive. The Chaos Champion, a brute named Krell, pointed his screaming axe at Battle Beast. "A new trophy for the Skull Throne," he bellowed, his voice amplified by his helmet's vox grill. "Whatever xeno-filth you are, your head will look magnificent, pinned to my pauldron." Battle Beast's lips pulled back into a wide, terrifying grin, revealing rows of teeth that had bitten through the hulls of starships. "Finally," he whispered, the sound lost in the roar of the bolter fire. A creature with a tongue to beg for mercy and a throat to scream. Krell didn't wait. He lunged, his jump pack igniting with a violent burst of flame that propelled him across the chamber. He swung his chain axe in a horizontal arc, designed to decapitate an Ogryn. Battle Beast didn't retreat. He stepped into the blow, catching the spinning teeth of the axe with the haft of his mace. The sparks showered his mane, the heat of the weapon singing his fur. He felt the vibration of the blow travel up his arms, a genuine, physical challenge. "You are strong for a cub," Battle Beast growled. His eyes locked onto the glowing red lenses of the Space Marine's helmet. "I am the death of worlds." Krell roared, kicking out with a ceramite-shod boot that would have shattered a human's ribcage. Thok took the hit, stumbling back only a single step, his laughter echoing louder than the battle around them. Around them, the Black Legion and the Necrons vanished into the periphery. The war for Orestes didn't matter. The Great Rift didn't matter. There was only the weight of the axe, the swing of the mace, and the glorious, crimson promise of a fight that might actually hurt. Battle Beast swung his second mace, a crushing blow that caught the champion in the ribs, caving in the reinforced power armor, and sending the giant flying through a stone sarcophagus. Thok didn't follow immediately. He stood in the center of the vault, chest heaving, his fur matted with dust and black oil. He looked at the hole in the ceiling, seeing the burning sky of the 41st millennium for the first time. He saw the massive cathedral ships of the Black Legion hanging in the clouds like vultures. He saw the flickering shadows of daemons dancing in the warp fire. "This world," Thok said, his voice trembling with a dark, newfound joy. "This universe, it is broken. It is cruel. It is hideous." He smashed his maces together, the shockwave cracking the floor beneath him. "I think I shall stay here until every single one of you is dead." The vault groaned as Krell, the champion of Khorne, hauled himself from the wreckage of the sarcophagus. His power armor was a ruin of twisted ceramite, the auto-senses in his helmet flickering with static. To any mortal man, the blow Battle Beast had dealt would have been a death sentence, a localized earthquake delivered via a mace head. But Krell was a creature of the warp as much as he was a soldier. He felt the warp fever rising in his blood, the butcher's nails in his brain firing with agonizing, ecstatic rhythm. He didn't feel the pain of his shattered ribs. He only felt the insult of being struck by a being that didn't scream a prayer to the blood god. "More!" Krell bellowed, his voice distorted by a throat that had been mutated into a jagged, vox-enhanced instrument of war. "Blood for the blood god! Skulls for the skull throne!" He ignited his jump pack again, but this time, it wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a desperate, heat-shrouded lunge. He swung his chain axe, the Weeping Gore, with a speed that blurred the air. The monomolecular teeth of the weapon bit into the stone floor, the metal, and the air itself, seeking the white fur of the intruder. Battle Beast didn't just parry, he danced. For a creature of his immense size, his movements possessed a terrifying fluidness. He slipped inside Krell's guard, his fist, large enough to crush a human skull like a grape, slamming into the Chaos Marine's chest plate. The sound was like a thunderclap in a confined space. Krell staggered, but his mutation-fueled resilience kept him upright. He roared, swinging his axe in a vertical cleave that should have split Thok from crown to navel. Thok caught the haft of the axe with his bare hand. The chain teeth ground against his palm, the reinforced skin of the Thraxan warrior sparking as if he were made of living iron. Blood, thick and dark, began to seep from the shallow cuts, but Battle Beast didn't flinch. Instead, he grinned. The sensation of his own blood was the only drug he had ever truly craved. "Is this the best your god can offer?" Battle Beast asked, his voice a low, rumbling challenge that seemed to vibrate the very air. "A tin man with a toy saw? I have killed empires. I have broken sun gods. You are a child playing at murder." With a sudden violent twist, Thok wrenched the chain axe from Krell's grip. The weapon's internal motor screamed in protest before the tempered steel of the haft snapped like a dry twig. He tossed the ruined weapon aside and gripped Krell by the throat, lifting the half-ton space marine off the ground as if he were a feather. Around them, the Black Legionaries paused. These were veterans of the Long War, men who had seen the horrors of the Eye of Terror and the madness of the Warp, yet they stared in stunned silence. Their champion, a monster who had claimed 1,000 skulls in the name of the Despoiler, was being handled like a disobedient pet. Krell clawed at Thok's wrist, his power fist sparking as he tried to find purchase. But Battle Beast wasn't interested in a struggle. He wanted a conclusion. He slammed Krell into the vault ceiling, then back down into the floor, over and over, turning the champion into a wrecking ball of his own destruction. The stone shattered. The Necron floor plates buckled. "You have no technique," Thok growled, his eyes glowing with a feral golden light. "No discipline, only rage. Rage is a seasoning, cub. It is not the meal." With a final, bone-breaking heave, Thok threw Krell toward the hole in the ceiling. The Chaos Marine soared through the air, crashing through the layers of hive debris until he disappeared into the smoke-choked sky above. Battle Beast didn't wait. He leaped, his powerful legs propelling him through the breach with a single bound. He emerged onto the surface of Orestes, and the scale of the carnage finally revealed itself. The Hive City was a sprawling, Gothic nightmare of obsidian towers and industrial canyons. Thousands of Black Legion ships hung in the low atmosphere, their bellies glowing with the heat of continuous orbital bombardment. In the streets below, millions of Imperial citizens were being herded like cattle toward sacrificial altars, while cultists in tattered robes sang hymns to the dark gods. But Battle Beast didn't see the suffering, he saw the targets. He landed on a raised ferrocrete platform, his impact cracking the foundation. Below him, a squad of Black Legion Chaos Marines was engaged in a firefight with a desperate group of Cadian shock troops. The guardsmen were being slaughtered, their lasguns flickering uselessly against the thick ceramite of the traitors. A Black Legionnaire noticed the white-maned giant and turned his bolter toward him. "Xeno, target identified." The bolt rounds exploded against Thok's chest. The concussive force would have pulverized a human, but Battle Beast merely grunted as the shrapnel peppered his fur. He charged. He didn't use his maces. He became a blur of claws and teeth. He tore through the first Marine, his hands ripping the power armor open like parchment to get to the meat beneath. He caught a second Marine by the helmet and crushed it, the sound of the helmet collapsing and the skull popping inside, echoing across the plaza. The Cadian soldiers stopped firing. Their sergeant, a man with a face scarred by a dozen campaigns, stared up at the creature. For a moment, he thought it was a daemon, something summoned by the traitors. But the creature wasn't attacking them with the erratic cruelty of the warp. It was fighting with a surgical, overwhelming efficiency. It was a predator, and the Black Legion was the prey. "Fall back!" the sergeant screamed, sensing that whatever this was, it wasn't an ally. "Get to the secondary defense line." "Move!" Battle Beast ignored the fleeing humans. They were nothing. Their souls were small, their strength negligible. He turned his attention back to the sky. High above, a massive, ornate transport craft was descending, guarded by a swarm of Helldrakes, demonic fighter craft that looked like mechanical dragons. The transport bore the personal sigil of a Chaos Lord, a high-ranking lieutenant of Abaddon himself. Thok felt the air pressure change. A shadow fell over the plaza. Krell, somehow still alive and fueled by a final, desperate gift from Khorne, plummeted from the sky, his armor now glowing with a dull, red heat. He landed 20 paces from Thok, his body a mass of exposed muscle and broken plate. He no longer looked human. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated slaughterlust. Khorne demands your skull, Krell hissed, his very breath coming out as a spray of hot blood. Battle Beast took a step forward, his maces held loosely at his sides. He looked at the Chaos Lord's transport, then back at the ruined champion. Your god is a scavenger, Thok said, his voice carrying over the roar of the Helldrakes. He waits for others to do the work, then claims the remnants. I do not serve scavengers, I serve the fight. Krell lunged one last time, a pathetic, staggering charge. Thok didn't even use his weapons. He stepped aside, caught Krell's head in both hands, and with a single, sharp motion, twisted. The snap of the neck was loud enough to be heard over the orbital thunder. Thok didn't stop there. He pulled. He ripped the head and the spinal column clean from the body, holding the trophy aloft as the red light of the warp storm bathed him. He looked up at the descending transport, at the thousands of warriors watching from the battlements of the hive. He let out a roar, a sound that was neither human nor Xeno, but the voice of a being that had finally found its home in the heart of a nightmare. Send me your kings, he screamed at the sky. Send me your gods. I am Thok, and I am still hungry. Deep within the warp, something stirred. Khorne, the blood god, sat upon his throne of brass and bone. He did not care from where the blood flowed, only that it flowed. But this was different. This was a purity of violence he had not seen in an age. He did not want Battle Beast's skull, not yet. He wanted to see how much of the galaxy this white beast could turn into a graveyard. The slaughter on Orestes did not end with the death of Krell. In the warp-stained logic of the 41st millennium, a vacuum of power is never empty for long. It is a wound that bleeds a psychic resonance across the stars, beckoning every predator in the segmentum. As Thok stood atop the ruins of the Hive Plaza, the severed head of the Chaos Champion still dripping in his hand, the very atmosphere began to vibrate with a new, discordant frequency. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of Imperial engines or the screeching dissonance of the warp. It was a roar, a million voices shouting a single, monosyllabic word that echoed through the upper atmosphere and shook the foundations of the Hive spires. Wah! High above the Black Legion fleet, the reality of the void was being torn asunder by something far less elegant than a warp rift. Asteroids, hollowed out and strapped with colossal, sputtering engines, orc rocks, smashed into the orbital plane. They didn't maneuver. They didn't use tactical formations. They simply fell. One of the massive, jagged craft clipped a Black Legion cruiser, the impact shearing through kilometers of Gothic architecture and venting thousands of Chaos acolytes into the cold vacuum. The orcs had arrived, and they hadn't come for the Hive's resources or the Imperium's secrets. They had come because the big fight was happening, and the psychic spores of the greenskins had tasted the blood of a new, legendary monster. Battle Beast dropped Krell's head, his ears twitching as he felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. He looked up just in time to see a streak of fire and scrap metal descending directly toward his position. A smaller orc boarding craft, a claw ship held together by rusted rivets and sheer willpower, slammed into the plaza less than 50 yards from him. The impact sent a shockwave of dust and debris that leveled the remaining statues of the Emperor. But Thok didn't move. He stood his ground, his golden eyes narrowing with a burgeoning sense of respect. The front hatch of the craft blew outward, propelled by explosive bolts. Out of the smoke stepped a wall of green muscle and jagged iron. These were not the scavengers of the Hive or the corrupted husks of the Black Legion. These were meganobes, orcs encased in massive suits of hydraulic-powered scrap armor, their crude power claws snapping with lethal intent. At their center stood a giant, even by orc standards, Morgruk Burnaface, a war boss of the Goth clan who had heard the whispers of a white-maned beast killing Chaos's finest. Morgruk looked at the pile of Black Legion corpses, then at Thok. He let out a wet, raspy laugh that sprayed green phlegm across his iron jaw plate. "You the white one?" the war boss bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar. "The one what broke the spiky boy." Battle Beast stepped forward, his maces held in a relaxed but lethal grip. He smelled the orcs, the scent of damp earth, pungent fungus, and cheap machine oil. It was a clean smell compared to the rot of chaos. "I am Thok," he said, his voice carrying an authority that even the orc's primal brains recognized. "And who are you, little green thing? Are you here to provide a challenge, or just to clutter my battlefield?" The Meganobs roared in outrage, but Morgruk raised a massive, piston-driven hand to silence them. The war boss leaned forward, his small, red eyes gleaming with a manic joy. "I'm Morgruk, and I think you're proper killy. But you ain't green, and if you ain't green, you're just a big target." He slammed his power claws together, sparks showering his soot-stained face. "Lads, get him! I want is Ed for me pointy stick." The charge was not a tactical movement, it was a landslide. The Meganobs ignited their crude rockets and lumbered forward, their heavy shooters opening up in a deafening chorus of Daka. Explosive slugs chewed up the ground around Battle Beast, but he didn't wait to be hit. He launched himself into the air, a white blur of kinetic energy that cleared the first rank of orcs in a single bound. He landed directly in front of a Meganob, his maces coming down in a synchronized strike that crushed the orc's heavy iron helmet into its chest cavity. The orcs didn't retreat. They didn't know how. They swarmed him, their massive claws snapping at his limbs, their blades hacking at his thick fur. Thok felt the sting of a chain chopper across his thigh and responded by grabbing the orc wielder and swinging him like a flail, using the armored body to smash through 3 more attackers. He was in his element. The orcs were physically powerful, their biology designed for one thing, the endurance of violence. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Battle Beast found himself having to exert real effort to kill his foes. He moved through the green tide like a hurricane. He tore limbs from sockets, crushed skulls with his bare hands, and used his maces to turn the Meganob's expensive scrap armor into coffins. But for every 10 orcs he killed, 20 more seemed to pour out of the claw ship. The air was thick with the scent of green spores and hot metal. Morgruk watched the carnage with growing glee. This was what he had lived for. A foe that didn't run, didn't use magic tricks, and just kept killing until the pile of bodies was high enough to climb. The war boss revved his massive, shoulder-mounted burner unit and charged, the flames licking the air as he closed the distance. "Get stuck in!" Morgruk screamed, swinging a massive power claw that could have snipped a Lehman Russ tank in half. Battle Beast caught the claw with both maces, the strain vibrating through his entire skeleton. The hydraulic power of the orc suit was immense, fueled by the collective belief of the Wa that Morgruk was the strongest. For a moment, the two titans were locked in a stalemate, a contest of raw, unadulterated strength. "You have spirit, Greenskin," Thok spat, his face inches from the war boss's tusked maw. "But you are clumsy." "Clumsy?" Morgruk laughed, and then he headbutted Battle Beast with an iron-shod forehead. The impact was like a cannonball hitting a stone wall. Thok's head snapped back, blood spraying from his nose. He stumbled, the first time he had been truly rattled in years. The orcs cheered, a deafening wall of sound that seemed to physically empower the war boss. Morgruk followed up with a sweeping kick that sent Battle Beast skidding across the plaza, crashing through the ruins of a command bunker. Thok lay in the rubble for a heartbeat, his vision swimming. He touched his nose, seeing the dark crimson on his fingers. He didn't feel anger, he felt a soaring, ecstatic sense of purpose. He stood up, shaking the dust from his white mane, and let out a laugh that silenced the orcs' cheering. It was a cold, terrifying sound, the laugh of a man who had finally found a reason to try. "Again," Battle Beast whispered, his golden eyes glowing with a light that made even the orcs hesitate. "Do it again." He didn't wait for Morgruk to move. He charged with a speed that left after-images in the smoke-caked air. He didn't use his maces this time. He hit the war boss with his shoulder, the impact shattering the hydraulic pistons in Morgruk's leg armor. As the giant orc tilted, Thok delivered a flurry of blows, punches and kicks that moved faster than the orc's nervous system could process. He was a master of 1,000 wars, and Morgruk was a street brawler. With a final, explosive leap, Battle Beast landed on the war boss's shoulders. He gripped the edges of the iron jaw plate and began to pull. The metal groaned, the rivets popping like gunshots. Morgruk thrashed, his flames spraying wildly into the air, but Thok was an anchor of pure, focused violence. "Your wah! Ends here, cub," Thok growled. With a sickening wrench of metal and bone, Battle Beast tore the entire upper half of the war boss's armor, and the head within it, away from the body. He stood atop the slumped, twitching remains of Morgruk Burnaface, and let out a roar that echoed across the entire hive city. The remaining Meganobes stopped. They looked at their fallen leader, then at the white-maned monster standing in his place. In the primitive, warp-sensitive minds of the orcs, a shift occurred. They didn't see a Xeno. They didn't see an enemy. They saw the new biggest. One of the Meganobes dropped his choppa and pointed a massive finger at Thok. He's Propa Killy, the orc whispered in awe. He's the biggest beast. Across the plaza, hundreds of orcs began to chant. It wasn't a cry of war, but of recognition. They began to stomp their feet, the rhythm shaking the world. Beast! 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 Thok looked at the green horde. His blood-stained face contorted in a mask of confusion and grim amusement. He hadn't just won a fight. He had inadvertently inherited an army. But as he looked toward the horizon, he saw the flickering lights of Imperial drop pods descending. The Inquisition had arrived to investigate the anomaly. Let them come, Thok said, wiping the green blood from his brow. I have only just begun to clear my plate. The high orbit of Orestes, once a congested highway of Imperial commerce, had become a graveyard of burning hulls and shattered dreams. From the bridge of the inquisitorial cruiser Purity's Fire, Inquisitor Erasmus Vane of the Ordo Xenos watched the Vox feeds with a cold, mounting dread. Vane had spent 3 centuries purging the galaxy of the alien and the deviant, but the data streaming from the surface of Hive Orestes defied every entry in the Librum Primaris. The Black Legion had been routed not by Imperial steel, but by a single, white-furred anomaly that was now leading a burgeoning wah of orcs through the heart of the capital spire. My lord, a tech priest, warbled, its voice a discordant melody of binary and fear. The subsurface scans indicate the subject's physiology is impossible. It generates no warp signature, yet it exerts a psychic-like gravity over the greenskins. They are not just following him, they are evolving in his presence. Their latent reality warping field is anchoring itself to his combat prowess. Vane adjusted his velvet robes, his hand resting on the hilt of his power sword. He is a catalyst. A predator so pure the orcs mistake him for a manifestation of their own gods. If he reaches the primary manufactorum, he will have enough biomass and scrap to launch a crusade that could threaten the entire sector. Deploy the 88th Vostroyan Firstborn and the Warhound Titan Lupus Rex. I want this beast reduced to ash before the prophet of the Wog senses a rival. On the surface, Thok didn't care about the politics of the Inquisition or the biology of the orcs. He was running through the primary transit tunnels of the hive, a white blur of muscle at the head of 10,000 screaming greenskins. To the orcs, Thok was a white gork, a whirlwind of violence that didn't stop for breath or parley. Every time he tore a hive gate off its hinges or pulverized an imperial barricade, the orcs' collective belief grew, fueling a frenzy that turned even the smallest Gretchen into a suicidal killer. The tunnel ahead exploded in a shower of blue sparks and molten steel. Emerging from the smoke was the Lupus Rex, a Warhound-class scout titan. It stood 2 stories tall, a bipedal cathedral of destruction, adorned with the skulls of traitors and the purity seals of the Mechanicus. Its plasma blast gun hummed with the power of a miniature sun, and its Vulcan megabolter spun with a sound like 1,000 angry gods. The orcs faltered, the primal fear of the god machine momentarily overriding their Wog spirit. But Thok didn't slow down. He didn't even draw his maces. He accelerated, his paws cracking the ferrocrete with every stride. Target locked, the Titan's princeps commanded within the amniotic tank of the cockpit. Purge the Xeno. The plasma blast gun fired. A bolt of superheated matter, hotter than the surface of a star, screamed toward Thok. In any other story, this would be the end. But Battle Beast had survived the vacuum of space and the collapse of stars. He sensed the heat and leaped, a soaring arc that took him 20 meters into the air. The plasma bolt struck the ground behind him, vaporizing 1,000 orcs in a split second, the shockwave tossing Thok even higher into the Gothic rafters of the transit hub. He caught a hanging industrial crane, swung himself with the grace of a predator, and launched again. He landed directly on the Titan's sloped carapace. The Lupus Rex groaned, its gyros struggling to compensate for the sudden, half-ton impact of the warrior. Get it off us! The princeps screamed, the Titan's servitors frantically trying to recalibrate. Thok didn't give them the chance. He slammed his fist into the reinforced armor of the Titan's head, the command bridge. The first punch dented the 3-inch thick plasteel. The second punch cracked the view slits. The third punch tore the entire forward observation port away, exposing the terrified crew within. Battle Beast looked down into the cockpit, his golden eyes reflecting the flickering emergency lights. He saw the princeps suspended in the tank, the wires and tubes connecting man to machine. For a moment, there was a flicker of disgust on Thok's face. "You hide inside a shell," Thok growled, his voice booming over the Titan's internal vox. "You borrow strength from wires. You are not a warrior. You are a parasite." He reached inside, gripped the princeps by his life support harness, and wrenched him from the tank. The connection snapped with a spray of cold fluid and static. The Titan, its soul suddenly severed, stumbled forward, its massive legs buckling until it crashed into a supporting spire, the impact bringing down millions of tons of masonry. Thok stood atop the wreckage, holding the limp, dying princeps by the throat. He looked at the orcs, who were now howling in a state of religious ecstasy. They had seen a white gork kill a Humi Stampa with his bare hands. The psychic energy in the air was so thick it began to manifest as green lightning, dancing between the scrap armor of the meganobes. Then, the sky died. The green lightning didn't come from the orcs on the ground. It came from the clouds. A massive shadow, larger than any hive spire, began to descend through the smog. It was a space hulk, a colossal conglomerate of thousands of derelict ships, asteroids, and warp debris. It bore the mark of the great beast, the prophet of Gork and Mork. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka had arrived. The prophet didn't land. He simply let the space hulk crush the northern hive sectors, the impact registering on seismographs across the planet. From the heart of the wreckage, a teleporter flare of impossible magnitude lit up the horizon. Out of the green fire stepped the largest orc in the galaxy. Gazkul was a mountain of muscle and cybernetics, his body rebuilt by the mad genius of Grotznik. His power claw was the size of a transport vehicle, and his gaze carried the weight of 1 billion orc souls. Gazkul didn't look at the burning hive. He didn't look at the fleeing Imperial soldiers. He looked toward the transit hub, his massive, red-lensed eye optic zooming in on the white figure standing atop the fallen Titan. "Dat one!" Gazkul bellowed, his voice amplified by 100 voxcasters until it echoed across the entire continent. "Dat one looks like a proper fight." The orcs following Thok suddenly went silent. They looked at the white beast, then at their prophet. The psychic tension was unbearable, a collision of two different greatnesses. Thok felt it too, a pressure on his chest he hadn't felt in centuries. This wasn't just a strong foe. This was a being that represented the collective will of a race built for war. Thok tossed the dead princeps aside and stepped off the Titan's head. He began to walk toward the horizon, toward the towering green shadow of Gazkul. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the wah field. "The prophet," Thok whispered, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his blood-flecked face. "I have heard of you. They say you are the voice of your gods." Gazkul began to move, his massive boots crushing the rubble of the hive. "I am de voice. I am de fist. And you are just a big kitty cat in de wrong garden." The two monsters closed the distance, the millions of orcs and humans around them forgotten. This wasn't a battle for Orestes anymore. This was a duel to decide who truly deserved the title of beast, in a galaxy where that word was the highest honor. As they met in the center of the ruined plaza, the very ground began to crack under the weight of their presence. The collision between Thok and Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka was not a sound, it was a seismic event. When the prophet's massive power claw, a relic of scrap and killing intent, met the twin maces of the battle beast, the resulting shockwave flattened the surrounding meganobes like tall grass in a gale. The air, already thick with the green static of the Wag field, seemed to ignite. For the first time in his long, blood-soaked life, Thok felt his feet slide backward across the ferrocrete. His muscles, dense as neutron star matter, coiled and surged as he fought to hold back the hydraulic pressure of the greatest orc in the galaxy. "Little beast!" Gazkul roared, his breath smelling of fermented fungus and the heat of 1,000 forges. "You fight good, but Gork says you're in the wrong nest. Mork says I'm gonna eat your heart." Your gods are imaginary, cub, Thok spat, his teeth bared in a snarl that would have stopped a heart. I am the only god in this plaza. I am the end of your lineage. With a violent, snapping motion, Thok redirected the force of the claw, spinning beneath the massive orc's reach and delivering a kick to Gazkul's cybernetic knee. The sound was like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. The prophet grunted, his massive frame tilting, but he didn't fall. Instead, he fired his shoulder-mounted big shootas at point-blank range. The explosive rounds chewed into Thok's back and shoulders, ripping away chunks of white fur and skin. Battle Beast didn't scream. He laughed, the sound a jagged, horrific harmony to the barking of the guns. He turned in the spray of his own blood, his maces descending like falling stars upon Gazkul's iron-shod head. High above, in the cold, sanctified silence of the Purity's fire, Inquisitor Vane watched the carnage through a high-resolution Pictcaster. His face was a mask of cold fury. The beast and the prophet were tearing the hive apart, but more importantly, they were feeding each other. The Wa field was intensifying, fueled by the sheer quality of the violence. If Gazkul won, he would be empowered beyond measure. If the White Xeno won, the orcs might follow him into the Eye of Terror itself. They are an affront to the Lex Imperialis, Vane whispered, his voice trembling with a zealot's conviction. One is a beast of the void, the other a cancer of the stars. Neither can be allowed to draw another breath. Captain, signal the chamber militant. We are deploying the Brotherhood of Iron. Below, the battle had reached a fever pitch. Thok and Gazkul were a blur of green and white, moving with a speed that defied their massive bulk. Thok had discarded one of his maces, choosing instead to grip Gazkul's power claw with his bare hand, his fingers digging into the reinforced plasteel. He was pummeling the prophet's face with his free fist, each blow cracking the orc's heavy iron jaw. Gazkul was retaliating with headbutts and stomps, his cybernetic eye optic glowing with a blinding red light. Then, the sky turned silver. 6 streaks of brilliant white light slammed into the plaza, forming a perfect hexagonal perimeter around the two combatants. As the dust cleared, the air grew suddenly, unnaturally cold. Out of the craters stepped the Grey Knights, the Emperor's most elite daemon hunters, clad in ornate, silver-gray Aegis power armor. They carried Nemesis force halberds that shimmered with a blue psychic fire, and their shoulder-mounted storm bolters were already tracking the targets. At their head was Brother Captain Arvan Stern, a veteran who had faced the Lords of the Warp and emerged unbroken. He looked at the two monsters in the center of the plaza and felt a profound sense of wrongness. The orc was a familiar evil, a tide of biological madness. But the white creature, it was a void. Stern's psychic senses, honed to detect the slightest ripple in the immaterium, found nothing when they touched Thok. No soul spark, no warp taint, no shadow. It was as if a hole had been cut out of reality in the shape of a warrior. By the Emperor's will. Stern's voice boomed through his helmet's vox grill. I cast you out. Abomination of the void. Your existence is a heresy against the materium. Another Tin Man? Thok roared, not even turning away from Gazkul. Wait your turn, Silver Cub. I am busy. Gazkul laughed, a wet, rattling sound. See? The humies are jealous. They want to join the big fight. Stern didn't hesitate. Purge them both. Leave only ash. The Grey Knights opened fire. These weren't standard bolter rounds. They were psychically charged shells designed to shred the souls of daemons. They struck Thok with the force of a psychic hammer. For the first time, Battle Beast felt a different kind of pain. Not the physical tearing of flesh, but a cold, invasive shiver that tried to unravel his very essence. It was an insult to his biology. He let go of Gazkul and turned toward the Silver Warriors, his eyes burning with a golden, predatory light that seemed to push back the Grey Knight's psychic aura. You speak of souls, Thok growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying guttural register. You speak of gods and heresies, but you are just meat in a different suit of armor. He leaped. The distance was 40 yards, but he covered it in a heartbeat. He landed in the center of the Grey Knight squad, his remaining mace swinging in a horizontal arc. Brother Librarian Karis raised his force halberd to parry, channeling his psychic might into the blade. In any other encounter, the weapon would have shattered the attacker's mind upon contact. But Thok had no mind for the warp to grip. He was a creature of pure, physical reality. The mace shattered the Nemesis halberd like glass, and continued through the librarian's chest plate. The silver armor, inscribed with 1,000 protective runes, buckled and collapsed. Karis was thrown backward, his psychic scream cut short as his heart was pulverized. "Karis?" Stern bellowed, his storm bolter spitting fire. The Grey Knights closed in, their halberds glowing with righteous fury. They fought with a precision that surpassed even the Black Legion, their movements synchronized by a collective psychic web. But Battle Beast was a master of the many versus one. He moved like a liquid shadow, slipping between their blades, his hands tearing at the joints of their armor. He caught one knight by the helmet and ripped it clear, then used the headless body as a shield against Stern's bolter fire. Ghazghkull, not to be outdone, charged into the fray from the other side. "My fight!" "No touchin'!" The prophet's power claw snipped a Grey Knight in half at the waist, the silver armor offering no more resistance than paper. The plaza became a three-way slaughterhouse. The orcs, seeing their prophet and their white Gork being attacked by the silver Humies, surged forward in a suicidal wave. The Grey Knights, though the pinnacle of human martial prowess, were being drowned in a sea of green flesh and the focused, planet-cracking violence of Thok. Inquisitor Vane, watching from above, realized his mistake. He had sent scalps to perform the work of a guillotine. "This is not a banishment," he whispered, his face pale. "This is a feeding frenzy. If that white creature kills Stern, he will have proven himself superior to the Emperor's own chosen. The sector will fall." He reached for the terminal that controlled the Purity's Fire's main battery. A localized lance strike would kill everyone in the plaza, Stern, the orcs, and the beast. It was a horrific sacrifice, but the Inquisition was built on horrific sacrifices. On the ground, Thok stood over a fallen Grey Knight, his hand buried in the warrior's chest. He looked up and saw the atmospheric ionization, the telltale sign of an orbital strike. He looked at Ghazghkull, who was currently using a Grey Knight as a club to beat another one. "The cowards in the sky are going to try and end our fun, Prophet," Thok said, a dark, blood-toothed grin on his face. Ghazghkull looked up, his red optic flickering. "Let's 'em try. We ain't done yet." Thok felt a surge of genuine respect for the green giant. He turned back to Stern, who was the last knight standing, his armor cracked and his blood staining the silver plates. "Run, Silver Cub," Thok said, his voice almost kind. "Or stay and die. Either way, this galaxy is exactly what I was looking for." The sky did not simply open. It vanished, replaced by a pillar of blinding, incandescent gold. Inquisitor Vane had authorized a localized lance strike, a scalpel of solar-grade energy, intended to cauterize the infection of the plaza. The beam struck with the weight of a falling star, turning the Gothic ruins, the thousands of screaming orcs, and the broken silver shells of the Grey Knights into a singular molten slurry. The atmosphere of Hive Orestes was pushed back by the sheer thermal pressure, creating a vacuum that snapped shut a second later, with a thunderclap that shattered every remaining pane of glass in the sector. From the bridge of the Purity's Fire, the view screens were whitewashed with static. Vane gripped the edge of the command dais, his knuckles white. "Report," he commanded. "Is the anomaly neutralized?" "Scanning, my lord," the tech priest replied, its mechadendrites twitching. "The plaza is gone. Thermal signatures are off the scale. No biological life could withstand. Wait. Movement. Two separate signatures. One is fluctuating, a localized warp jump. The greenskin prophet has been pulled away by his weird boys. But the other, the white signature, is stable. It is moving." Down in the smoldering crater, where the ground had turned to obsidian slick glass, Battle Beast stood up. His white fur was charred, matted with soot and the vaporized remains of his enemies. Large patches of his skin were raw, weeping blood that sizzled against the cooling ground. His cape was a singed rag, and his maces were lost beneath the slag. But as he exhaled, a cloud of steam and ash billowing from his lungs, his golden eyes remained undimmed. He had survived an orbital lance strike. He felt the pain, a searing, wonderful agony that reminded him he was still alive in a galaxy that was trying very hard to kill him. He looked around. Ghazghkull was gone, vanished in a crackle of green lightning just before the beam hit. The Grey Knights were cinders. Thok spat a glob of bloody phlegm onto the glass floor. "Cowards," he rumbled. "They cannot win a fight, so they throw fire from the clouds. This Imperium is a kingdom of frightened children." He didn't stay to be targeted again. With a single, explosive leap, He cleared the lip of the kilometer-wide crater and vanished into the labyrinthine industrial canyons of the Hive. He needed a way off this world. He had tasted the strength of the orcs and the zealotry of the Inquisition, but he had heard the dying whispers of the Grey Knights through their vox grills. They had spoken of Fenris. They had spoken of the Great Wolf. Thok found what he was looking for in the secondary spaceport, a Black Legion Dreadclaw drop pod that had failed to launch during the retreat. Its crew of chaos cultists were huddled inside, praying to gods that had long since abandoned them. Thok didn't pray. He tore the hatch from its hinges, tossed the cultists into the waiting maws of the starving Hive mutants, and stepped into the cramped, blood-stained interior. He had spent centuries navigating the star paths of his own universe. The crude, brutal technology of the 41st millennium was a simple puzzle of levers and burning fuel. As the Dreadclaw ignited its thrusters and screamed into the upper atmosphere, Thok looked down at the burning world of Orestes. It was a beautiful graveyard, but it was too small. He needed the ones they called the Sons of Rus. He had heard they were the Emperor's executioners, warriors who embraced the beast within. The transit through the warp was a nightmare that would have broken the mind of any other mortal. Without a Geller field to protect the small craft, the raw essence of the Immaterium leaked through the hull. Daemons, thin and spindly things born of doubt and hunger, clawed at the edges of his vision. They whispered promises of godhood, of endless slaughter, of a throne made of the bones of his rivals. Battle Beast sat in the center of the vibrating pod, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic. When a lesser daemon of Tzeentch manifested in the corner, a flickering horror of blue fire and many-jointed limbs, Thok didn't reach for a weapon. He simply opened one eye and looked at the entity. "You are a thought," Thok said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "I do not fight thoughts. I fight meat. If you wish to die, manifest a heart for me to stop. Otherwise, be silent." The daemon hissed, its form flickering, as it realized there was no fear to feed upon, no ambition to twist. Thok's soul was a fortress of singular purpose, the hunt. There was no room for the machinations of chaos. Frustrated, the entity vanished back into the aether. Weeks passed in the timeless gray of the warp. Thok spent them in a state of meditative stasis, his body knitting itself back together. The Thraxan physiology was a marvel of evolution. His charred skin peeled away to reveal fresh, dense muscle, and his fur began to regrow in thick, snowy tufts. By the time the Dreadclaw was spat back into real space by a stabilizing warp eddy, Battle Beast was at 90% capacity, and his hunger for a true challenge had become a physical ache. He emerged in the Fenris system. The stars here were cold, distant, and unforgiving. Before him lay the world of Fenris, a planet of ice, fire, and monsters. He could see the Fang, the colossal mountain fortress of the Space Wolves, piercing the atmosphere like a jagged tooth. Even from orbit he could sense the martial pride radiating from the world. His arrival did not go unnoticed. The Space Wolves were not the bureaucratic defenders of a hive world. They were hunters who guarded their territory with a feral intensity. Within minutes of his entry into the system, a strike cruiser, the Fangs of the World Wolf, moved to intercept the unidentified chaos craft. "Identify yourself, traitor dog," a voice boomed over the Dreadclaw's voxlink, thick with a Fenrisian accent. "You are in the domain of the Vilca Fenrica. State your business before we turn your hull into scrap." Thok leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile crossing his face. He didn't know how to use the ship's transmitter, so he simply punched the console until the wide-frequency broadcast light flickered. "I am Thok," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the vox arrays of the Imperial cruiser. "I have heard that the Sons of Rus are the greatest warriors of this pathetic empire. I have come to see if you are men or if you are merely dogs on a leash. Send your strongest. I will be waiting on the ice." He didn't wait for a reply. He steered the Dreadclaw into a suicidal descent, the pod glowing red as it hit the atmosphere of Fenris. It wasn't a landing, it was a strike. The craft plummeted through the eternal blizzards of the northern hemisphere, smashing into a frozen sea of ice, miles from the base of the Fang. The impact sent a plume of snow and shattered ice 100 feet into the air. When the steam cleared, Battle Beast stepped out onto the tundra. The wind howled at 80 miles per hour, the temperature cold enough to freeze human blood in seconds. Thok breathed in the air, the frost coating his whiskers. He didn't feel the cold. He felt the weight of the world. The gravity of Fenris was higher than standard. its environment a constant test of survival. "Good," Thok whispered, his breath a white plume. From the horizon, he heard a sound that warmed his heart, the long, mournful howl of a Fenrisian wolf. But it was followed by the rhythmic thrum of anti-grav engines and the heavy clatter of power armor. Across the ice, 3 Stormfang gunships descended, their prows carved into the likeness of snarling wolves. Out of the lead ship leaped a giant clad in sea-gray armor, adorned with wolf pelts and teeth. He carried a frost axe that shimmered with an inner, sub-zero light. This was Haldor Icepelt, a battle leader of the Great Company. He looked at the white-maned Xeno standing alone in the wastes, and didn't see a monster. He saw a challenge to the honor of his chapter. "You have a loud voice for a Xeno," Haldor said, his breath misting in the air. "But on Fenris, we do not value words. We value the kill." Thok reached down and picked up a jagged shard of ice, crushing it in his fist. "Then let us see, little wolf. Show me the teeth of Fenris." The ice of Fenris did not break. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the sub-zero marrow of the world. Haldor Icepelt moved with the practiced, predatory grace of a warrior born in a blizzard and forged in the fires of 1,000 wars. He did not charge with the mindless frenzy of the World Eaters, or the robotic precision of the Ultramarines. He moved like a wolf, low, calculating, and patient. His frost axe, Hrimthur, hissed as it cut through the frigid air, the blue power field around the blade crackling with the temperature of the void. Thok did not wait for the strike. He met it. Battlebeast stepped into the arc of the axe, his hand, rebuilt and reinforced by the sheer evolutionary spite of his species, closing around Haldor's armored forearm. The sound of ceramite cracking under Thok's grip was like a pistol shot in the silence of the tundra. Haldor grunted, his free hand driving a combat blade toward Thok's throat, but the white titan was already moving. He twisted the battle leader's arm, using the Space Wolf's own momentum to heave him across the ice. Haldor skidded 50 yards, his power armor's auto-stabilizers throwing up a curtain of powdered snow as he regained his footing. "You have the scent of a killer," Haldor said, spitting a mouthful of blood into the snow. He didn't look discouraged, he looked invigorated. "But you are on the wrong world to be a predator, Xeno. Here, the very air wants you dead." "The air is thin, little wolf," Thok rumbled, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. "And your strike was thin. You rely on that trinket in your hand. Without the axe, you are just a cub in a heavy coat." From the surrounding mists, the rest of the pack emerged. Intercessors in the gray-blue plate of the Space Wolves fanned out, their bolt rifles leveled, but they didn't fire. On Fenris, honor demanded that a challenge be answered. However, the honor of the chapter also demanded the extermination of the threat. Out of the whiteout conditions behind Haldor, the heavy thrum of paws hit the ice. Thunderwolf cavalry, marines mounted on lupine beasts the size of rhinos, circled the perimeter. Their mounts were creatures of nightmare, cybernetically enhanced and driven by a hunger that matched their riders. Thok's mane bristled. He felt it now, the spirit of the world. It was a harsh, unrelenting pressure, a psychic weight that spoke of 1,000 generations of survival. He felt the orcs wah. The field was a blunt instrument, but this was a whetted blade. "Attack me together," Thok roared, his voice shattering a nearby ice pillar. "Show me the pack. Show me why the galaxy fears the sons of the Great Wolf." Haldor howled, a sound that was picked up and carried by every marine and wolf in the valley. It was the signal for the hunt. The Thunderwolves charged, their massive claws shredding the permafrost. The first rider, a veteran named Biane, swung a frost sword that hummed with lethal intent. Thok didn't dodge. He caught the Thunderwolf by its cybernetic jaw as it leaped. The beast's bite force was enough to crush steel, but Thok's arm was a pillar of unyielding muscle. He wrenched the wolf's head to the side, snapping its neck, and used the massive carcass as a bludgeon to knock the rider from his saddle. The ice became a swirling vortex of fur, blood, and gray armor. Battlebeast was a whirlwind. He caught a bolt round in his shoulder, the explosion blooming in a red flower of pain, and responded by lunging at the shooter, tearing the bolt rifle from the Marine's hands and snapping it over his knee. He was laughing again, a deep, joyful sound that seemed to offend the very spirits of the Fenrisian winter. He punched a Thunderwolf mid-lunge, his fist caving in its skull, and then spun to catch Haldor's returning axe strike with his bare palm. The frost field bit deep this time. The sub-zero energy tried to flash freeze Thok's blood, turning his hand into a brittle statue. But Thok's internal temperature surged, his heart beating with the fury of a dying star. He forced his fingers to close around the blade, the ice shards of his own frozen flesh flying into the air. "My turn," Thok whispered. He pulled Haldor toward him and delivered a headbutt that shattered the battle leader's helmet. The ceramite faceplate disintegrated, revealing Haldor's scarred, bearded face. The space wolf staggered, his vision blurring, but the curse of the wolfen, the latent, primal mutation in the space wolf's gene seed, began to stir in his blood. His pupils slit, his canines lengthened, and a guttural, inhuman growl tore from his throat. Thok froze, his eyes widening. He felt the shift. This wasn't just a warrior getting angry. This was a biological transformation, a regression into a more perfect killing form. The other space wolves in the pack began to change as well, their movements becoming more erratic, more feral. "Yes," Thok breathed, a look of genuine wonder on his face. "This is it. The beast within the man. Show it to me. Let me see the monster you hide behind your prayers." The skirmish escalated into a slaughter. The space wolves, now partially succumbed to the wolfen rage, fought with a suicidal disregard for their own safety. They clawed at Thok's legs, bit at his throat, and slammed their armored bodies into him with the force of battering rams. Thok was covered in blood, most of it his own, but a significant portion belonging to the Sons of Russ. He was a mountain of white fur being eroded by a gray tide. He felt the cold now, not as an external force, but as the slow cooling of his own limbs as his wounds multiplied. He caught a wolfen-touched marine by the throat and slammed him into the ice, with such force that the ground beneath them spider-webbed for 100 yards. But as he stood up, he found himself surrounded. Haldor stood before him, blood streaming from his ruined nose, his eyes glowing with a yellow, lupin light. Behind him, a silhouette larger than any of the others appeared in the blizzard. It was a suit of Terminator armor, but it was shaped like a walking fortress. It bore the Great Wolf's personal sigil. Logan Grimnar, the High King of Fenris, had arrived to see what manner of creature had dared to spill the blood of his kin on the sacred ice. He carried the axe of Morkai, a weapon forged from the blade of a greater daemon of Khorne, purified by the fire of Fenris. Grimnar didn't speak. He didn't need to. The authority he radiated was absolute. He looked at the bodies of the Thunderwolves, at his wounded battle leader, and then at the white-maned Titan who stood defiantly in the center of the carnage. Thok felt it. The true apex. This was not the mindless rage of the orcs, or the flickering shadows of the warp. This was the master of the hunt. This was the one who decided who lived and who died on this world. "You," Thok said, his voice raspy, his chest heaving. He pointed a blood-dripping finger at Grimnar. "You are the one they call the Great Wolf. You are the one who leads this pack of curs." Grimnar stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath his massive, ancient boots. The axe of Morkai began to hum, a low, hungry sound that seemed to draw the light from the air. "I am Logan Grimnar," the High King said, his voice a deep, weathered rumble. "And you are a guest who has overstayed his welcome. On Fenris, we have a tradition for those who come seeking blood." He raised the axe of Morkai. "We give them exactly what they asked for." Thok felt his heart hammer against his ribs, not with fear, but with a soaring, terminal joy. He knew, with the instinct of a creature that had lived through 1,000 deaths, that this fight would be different. This was the worthy death he had sought across the stars. "Then come, King of Dogs," Thok roared, his golden eyes igniting with a final, brilliant light. "Show me if your teeth are as sharp as your legends." The axe of Morkai did not merely strike, it hungered. As Logan Grimnar swung the ancient, demon-forged weapon, the air around the blade didn't just part, it shrieked. This was a weapon that had once belonged to a champion of the blood god, its steel thirsty for the essence of the living, now bound by the holy runes of the Iron Priests and the indomitable will of the Great Wolf. To Thok, the weapon was the most beautiful thing he had seen in this galaxy. It possessed a weight that transcended physics, a metaphysical gravity that promised the one thing Battle Beast had traveled across dimensions to find: an ending. The first clash sent a shockwave across the frozen sea that shattered the ice for miles in every direction. Thok didn't parry with a weapon. He met the edge of the axe with his crossed forearms, his muscles hardening into pillars of biological iron. The impact was so great that the ground beneath them vanished, turning into a localized crater of powdered frost. Thok felt the monomolecular edge of Morkai bite through his skin, through the dense layers of muscle, until it scraped against the bone of his ulna. "Magnificent!" Thok wheezed, the spray of his own blood freezing in the air before it could hit the ground. Grimnar didn't answer with words. He twisted the axe, the daemon spirit within the blade snarling in psychic resonance, and delivered a kick that would have caved in the side of a predator tank. Battle Beast took the hit, his ribs snapping with a sound like dry timber, but he used the pain as a fulcrum. He gripped the haft of the axe and pulled, bringing his forehead down in a catastrophic strike against Grimnar's exposed face. The great wolf's head snapped back, blood blooming from his brow, but he didn't stumble. He was a son of Fenris, a creature of ice and iron, and he had been fighting monsters since before Thok's ancestors had learned to sharpen stones. They became a blur of silver, gray, and white. To the surrounding space wolves, who stood in a silent, respectful circle despite their own bleeding wounds, the duel was a religious experience. It was the saga of the end times made flesh. Grimnar moved with a speed that defied his massive Terminator plate, the axe of Morkai weaving a web of lethal light around him. Thok was a whirlwind of predatory adaptation, his body absorbing wounds that would have killed a battalion. He lost chunks of flesh to the axe's bite. His white mane was now almost entirely crimson, but every time he was struck, he grew faster, his golden eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of focused, murderous intent. "You are more than a man," Thok growled, catching a vertical cleave between his palms, the blade inches from his skull. "You are the soul of this world. To kill you would be to kill Fenris itself. Then die knowing the world rejected you, Xeno," Grimnar roared, channeling the ancestral fury of the Vilka Fenrika into a massive overhead swing. But as the blade descended, the sky above Fenris did not just darken, it bled. The eternal blizzard of the northern pole was suddenly suppressed by a wave of heat so intense it turned the snow into a suffocating fog of steam. The psychic weight that had been pressing down on the world, the spirit of Fenris, was suddenly drowned out by a deafening rhythmic thrumming. It was the sound of a heartbeat, but it was the size of a continent. It was the sound of the butcher's nails, amplified by the raw malice of the warp. Across the horizon, a rift opened. It wasn't a tear in space, it was a wound in reality that wept liquid fire and molten brass. Out of the hole stepped a nightmare that made the great wolf and the battle beast look like children. He was a mountain of scorched red muscle, encased in jagged, brass-rimmed plate that pulsed with the heat of a billion murders. His wings, tattered and vast, cast a shadow of terminal despair over the ice. He carried a sword the size of a starship's hull, the Black Blade, and an axe that had tasted the blood of worlds. Angron, the Red Angel, the daemon primarch of the World Eaters, had been beckoned. The blood spilled by Thok and Grimnar, two of the purest martial entities in the galaxy, had acted as a beacon through the immaterium. Khorne, the blood god, had grown tired of watching from his throne. He wanted the white beast, he wanted the great wolf, and he had sent his most broken, most violent son to collect the tithe. Angron let out a roar that shattered the atmospheric domes of the Fang hundreds of miles away. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage, a psychic shockwave that sent the remaining space wolves to their knees, their ears bleeding, their minds fracturing under the weight of the Primarch's madness. Grimnar stepped back, his axe lowered, his face pale. He knew this horror. He had faced the Red Angel before during the First War for Armageddon. He knew that this was not a fight that could be won with steel alone. But Thok was different. Battle Beast stood in the center of the steaming ice, his chest heaving, his body a map of scars and fresh gouges. He looked up at the towering daemon god, at the wings that blotted out the stars, at the sword that dripped with the ichor of 1,000 civilizations. He didn't feel the psychic dread. He didn't feel the madness of the nails. He felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in 10,000 years. He felt small, and it was the most intoxicating feeling of his life. "Finally," Thok whispered, a single tear of blood tracing a path down his cheek. A mountain worth climbing. Angron didn't acknowledge Thok's words. He didn't acknowledge the Imperium or the honor of Fenris. He saw only meat. He saw only the blood tithe. He plummeted from the sky, his landing liquefying the ice for a mile in every direction, the steam rising in a pillar that could be seen from orbit. He swung the black blade in a horizontal arc that intended to erase everything in the valley. Grimnar threw himself flat, the blade passing over him with a sound like a shearing mountain. But Thok didn't duck. He leaped. He met the black blade in midair. He didn't try to stop it. He grabbed the jagged edge of the massive weapon, his hands vaporizing as the warp fire within the blade touched his skin. He used the momentum of the swing to launch himself toward Angron's chest, his feet finding purchase on the Primarch's brass breastplate. He began to climb the Daemon God, his claws digging into the red flesh, his teeth baring as he sought the Primarch's throat. "I am Thok!" he screamed into the face of the Red Angel, his voice a tiny, defiant spark against the roar of the warp. "And I have come to kill a god." Angron's massive hand, large enough to crush a rhino transport, closed around Thok, tearing him from his chest. The Primarch didn't even look at the creature in his grip. He simply began to squeeze, the pressure enough to turn diamond into dust. Thok's skeleton groaned, his internal organs rupturing, but he didn't stop. He bit into Angron's thumb, his powerful jaws tearing away a chunk of daemon flesh that tasted of sulfur and ancient hate. Below, Logan Grimnar stood up, his eyes meeting the wounded golden gaze of the battle beast. In that moment, the High King of Fenris made a choice. He didn't see a Xeno. He saw a brother in arms, a warrior who was doing the impossible to buy the galaxy one more breath of life. "For the Emperor! For the Wolf Father!" Grimnar bellowed, his voice cutting through the madness. He charged, not at Thok, but at the Daemon Primarch. The axe of Morkai hummed with a new, desperate light, as the Great Wolf and the Battle Beast began a coordinated assault on the Red Angel. A duel between the strongest warriors of two universes and the living embodiment of rage itself. The air on Fenris was no longer cold. It was a pressurized furnace of psychic agony. The presence of Angron had turned the atmospheric moisture into a sticky red mist, blood rain that sizzled as it touched the permafrost. For any other warrior, the proximity to the Red Angel would have been a death sentence of the mind. The butcher's nails, those ancient, cursed implants hummed in Angron's skull, emitting a rhythmic, jagged frequency that forced the hearts of nearby mortals to burst or their brains to liquefy into mindless rage. But as Thok clung to the Primarch's brass-bound neck, he didn't feel the pull of the nails. He felt a purity of focus that surpassed anything he had ever known. His world had narrowed to the texture of Angron's skin, a surface like hot, cured leather, and the rhythmic thud of a heart that beat with the cadence of a dying galaxy. Angron roared, a sound that tore the clouds asunder, and slammed his back against a jagged obsidian spire that had thrust up from the ice. The impact was enough to pulverize a fortress wall. Thok took the full force of the blow, his spine cracking with a sound like a snapping mast, and his grip momentarily loosened. The Daemon Primarch seized the opening, grabbing Thok by his midsection and hurling him into the air. Before Battle Beast could right himself, Angron followed with a wing-assisted lunge, swinging the black blade in a vertical arc that could have split a mountain. Thok, midair and broken, did the only thing a master of 10,000 wars could do. He didn't try to block the blade. He kicked off the flat of the steel as it passed him, using the immense kinetic energy of the swing to propel himself toward Angron's face. He was a white and red blur, a dying star refusing to go cold. He landed on the Primarch's brow, his claws digging into the brass cables that snaked from Angron's skull like mechanical dreadlocks. With a roar that matched the Primarch's own, Thok began to rip. He tore the cables from the daemon's flesh, sparking psychic fire and black ichor spraying across his face. "I am the Predator!" Thok screamed, his voice raw and blood-choked. "You are just a bigger cage! Break for me!" Angron's response was a surge of warp fire that erupted from his very pores. The heat was enough to melt ceramite, and Thok's fur finally ignited, turning him into a living torch. The pain was absolute, a white-hot wall that threatened to consume his consciousness. Yet, in that abyss of suffering, Thok found a new level of strength. His biology, pushed to the absolute brink, began to compensate with a violent, desperate evolution. His muscles fused, his bones thickened, and his will hardened into a diamond point of singular intent. He would not die until he had seen the light fade from this god's eyes. Below them, Logan Grimnar saw the opening. The Great Wolf was a master of the hunt, and he knew that Thok's suicidal assault had provided the only chance the galaxy would get to banish the Red Angel. Grimnar took a deep, frost-laden breath, channeling the collective faith of the Volca Fenrica into the axe of Mordecai. The weapon, already hungry for daemon blood, began to glow with a brilliant, freezing light that pushed back the heat of the Primarch's aura. "Now, brothers," Grimnar bellowed, his voice amplified by the Vox network of the Fang. "For the Allfather, for Fenris!" The surviving Space Wolves, their minds anchored by the Great Wolf's resolve, opened fire with everything they had. Hellfrost cannons, Melta rifles, and heavy bolters converged on the Red Angel, create a localized sun of destructive energy. The barrage didn't kill Angron, nothing in the mortal arsenal could, but it staggered him. It forced the daemon to divide his focus between the white beast on his head and the gray tide on the ground. Angron swung his axe, Spitefiler, in a wide circle, vaporizing the nearest line of space wolves and turning the ice into a lake of boiling blood. But in that moment of distraction, Thok acted. He didn't go for the eyes. He didn't go for the throat. He reached into the gaping wound he had torn in the Primarch's skull and gripped the central cluster of the butcher's nails, the mechanical rot that fueled Angron's existence. Thok's hands were charred to the bone, the nerves long since burnt away, but he didn't need feeling. He needed leverage. He braced his feet against Angron's jaw and pulled with every ounce of his soul. The sound was not of this world. It was a psychic shriek that echoed across the Eye of Terror, a wail of 10,000 years of suppressed agony. The butcher's nails, fused with Angron's very essence, resisted. The warp fire around them intensified, turning the air into a shimmering veil of purple and gold. Thok's muscles tore from his bones, his eyes began to bleed from the pressure, but he did not let go. "Kneel," Thok roared, the word a physical command that seemed to lock the laws of reality. Angron staggered, his massive knees hitting the ice with a force that triggered avalanches in the distant mountains. The Daemon Primarch's black blade fell from his hand, clattering onto the frozen sea like a dead moon. For a heartbeat, the rage in Angron's eyes flickered, replaced by a momentary horrific clarity. The face of the man he had been before the nails and the gods had claimed him. Logan Grimnar didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, the axe of Mordecai held in a two-handed grip. He leaped onto the Primarch's chest and drove the daemon-slaying blade into Angron's throat with the weight of a world's vengeance. The explosion of energy was catastrophic. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated warp light erupted from the point of impact, throwing Grimnar and Thok in opposite directions. The ice beneath them finally gave way, collapsing into the dark, freezing depths of the Fenrisian Ocean. Angron's physical form began to disintegrate, his essence being sucked back into the warp by the vacuum his own rage had created. As the Red Angel vanished, he let out one final, haunting roar, not of anger, but of recognition. He had been defeated not by an army, but by a warrior who had found the one thing Angron had lost, the choice to die with honor. Thok hit the water, the freezing dark closing over him. His body was a wreck, limbs broken, skin charred, internal organs failing. He sank into the abyss, the bubbles of his last breath rising toward the shattered surface. He felt the cold, and for the first time in his life, it was a comfort. He had done it. He had challenged a god of the most violent galaxy in existence, and he had made that god bleed. But the 41st millennium is not a place for happy endings. As Thok's consciousness began to fade, he felt a tug on his spirit. Not the cold hand of death, but something older, something more patient. In the darkness of the deep, a green light began to flicker. Not the green of the orcs, but the emerald fire of Necron technology. A tesseract labyrinth, similar to the one he had escaped from, drifted toward him through the freezing currents. Behind it, a figure in ancient, shimmering robes watched from the shadows of a cloaked ship. Trazine the Infinite had been tracking his lost specimen since Orestes. He had watched the carnage, the duels, and the stand against the Primarch, with the detached curiosity of a collector. A magnificent performance, Trazine's voice echoed in the silence of Thok's mind. A warrior of your caliber is a rare find in this era of stagnation. You have earned a place in my most prestigious gallery. You shall be the center of my end of the 41st Millennium exhibit. Thok tried to raise a hand, to strike one last blow against the thief of time, but his body finally failed him. The Tesseract labyrinth opened, its emerald light swallowing the battle beast. Reality snapped shut, and the ocean of Fenris returned to its silent, frozen vigil. The transition was not a death, but it was an insult. For a being like Thok, who defined his existence by the friction of muscle against resistance and the heat of blood spilled in the dirt, the cold, geometric perfection of a tesseract labyrinth was a special kind of hell. Inside the hyperspatial pocket, time did not flow. It sat in a stagnant pool. He was suspended in a state of chronological stasis, his last roar frozen in his throat, his charred hand still reaching for a throat that was no longer there. But Thok was not a standard specimen. His will, forged in the fires of 1,000 dead worlds, was a physical weight that pressed against the emerald walls of his prison. Even in stasis, the battle beast was a predator that refused to be taxidermied. Outside the labyrinth, the world of Solemnace hummed with the silent, tireless industry of the Necrons. Trazyn the Infinite, Archaeovist of the Nihilok dynasty, walked through the corridors of his great gallery with the measured, clicking step of a conqueror who had won without firing a shot. He passed rows of suspended history, a squad of mid-transformation Hrud, a perfect specimen of a Krork warrior from the War in Heaven, and a collection of Cadian high officers frozen in the moment of their greatest despair. He stopped before a new plinth, one situated in a place of honor near the primacy of violence exhibit. Trazyn adjusted his empathic resonator, peering through the translucent surface of the tesseract. Inside, the white-maned titan was a ruin of scorched flesh and broken bone, yet the look in its golden eyes was so intense that the Necron Lord felt a rare flicker of something akin to unease. "Truly a remarkable find," Trazyn murmured to the empty air, his voice a dry rasp of ancient data streams. "To challenge a daemon Primarch with nothing but claw and conviction. The Imperium calls it heresy. The Orcs call it a god. I call it irreplaceable." Trazyn tapped a command into his staff, and a series of holographic displays flickered to life around the plinth. They showed the ripples Thok had left across the segmentum in his brief, violent tenure. On Orestes, the cult of the White Beast had taken root among the surviving workers, a heretical sect that preached salvation through the mastery of one's own strength, an ideology the Inquisition was currently purging with planet-wide pyres. In the void, the orcs of the Goth clan were still painting their rocks white, their weird boys screaming of a white Gork who would return to lead the ultimate Wog to the foot of the Golden Throne. Even on Fenris, the impact was profound. Logan Grimnar had ordered the Skalds of the Fang to compose a new saga, the Saga of the Starstrider. It was the first time in 10,000 years that a Xeno's deeds had been recorded in the halls of the Space Wolves, not as a warning, but as a testament to martial honor. The Great Wolf himself bore the scars of their duel, with a strange pride, a silent acknowledgement that for 1 hour on the ice, two predators from different realities had stood as brothers against the dark. "You have become a legend," Thok Trazyn said, his metallic fingers tracing the edge of the containment field. "A catalyst for 1 billion deaths. Your presence accelerated the entropy of this sector by 3%. Such a delightful disruption." But as Trazyn turned to continue his rounds, the hum of the Tesseract labyrinth changed. It wasn't the smooth, melodic vibration of a stable field. It was a discordant, rhythmic thumping. Trazyn froze. He turned back, his ocular sensors zooming in on the specimen. Thok's heart was beating. In a realm where time was supposed to be irrelevant, the battle beast's physiology was fighting back. His Thraxan cells, pushed to a state of hyper-evolutionary frenzy by the duel with Angron, were ignoring the laws of Necron physics. The charred skin was sloughing off in the stasis field, replaced by fresh, dense muscle that pulsated with a terrifying vitality. The golden eyes weren't just staring, they were tracking. "Impossible," Trazyn whispered, his systems recalibrating. "The chronometric lock is absolute. No biological entity can exert force within the tesseract cracked." A thin, spiderweb fracture appeared on the emerald surface, and a single drop of Thok's blood, hot, crimson, and smelling of iron, seeped through. The blood hit the floor of the gallery with a sizzle, a biological impurity in a world of sterile metal. Inside the prison, Thok's mind was a furnace. He didn't know where he was, and he didn't care. He knew only that there were walls around him, and walls were things to be broken. He remembered the Red Angel. He remembered the Great Wolf. And he knew that if this galaxy could produce such monsters, then it surely held even greater treasures deeper in the shadows. He didn't want escape. He wanted the next floor of the arena. He focused every ounce of his soul into his right fist. He didn't think about the Necron technology or the millions of years of history surrounding him. He thought about the sound of a skull cracking. He thought about the weight of a mace. He thought about the look on the Emperor's face when he finally reached the heart of this pathetically grand empire. The vibration in the gallery intensified. Other exhibits began to rattle in their cages. The Krork warrior in the nearby stasis field seemed to twitch in sympathetic resonance to the raw, unadulterated violence radiating from the Tesseract. Trazyn raised his staff, his internal logic engines screaming of a containment breach that could destabilize the entire wing of Solemnace. Security protocols. All Leichguard to the primacy wing, Trazyn commanded, his voice echoing through the silent halls. But it was too late. The Tesseract labyrinth didn't just break, it detonated. The emerald glass shattered into a billion razor-sharp shards, and the stasis field collapsed with a roar of displaced air. Battle Beast stepped out onto the cold metal of Solemnace, his white fur regrown, his scars glowing with a faint, residual warp heat. He stood tall, his chest heaving, his mane bristling like a crown of winter. He looked at Trazyn, then at the endless rows of stasis fields containing the greatest warriors, monsters, and gods of a dozen eras. He saw the Krork. He saw the Aeldari Phoenix Lords. He saw the corrupted husks of ancient tyrants. A slow, terrifying grin spread across Thok's face. He wasn't trapped in a museum. He was in the greatest hunting ground in the multiverse. "You have a very impressive collection, little machine," Thok said, his voice a low, joyful rumble that shook the foundations of the World Vault. He reached out and grabbed a nearby Necron Guardian by the head, crushing the living metal with a single, casual squeeze. He looked at the vast, darkened halls of Solemnace, hearing the rhythmic clatter of 10,000 Leichguard approaching. He felt the weight of his own strength returning, his heart beating with the drumfire of a war that would never, ever end. "I think," Battle Beast whispered, his golden eyes igniting with the light of a predator who had finally found home, "that I am going to break every single one of your toys." Deep within the warp, the Chaos Gods shifted. In the high spires of Terra, the Emperor's tarot turned to the card of the beast. On 1,000 worlds, the slaughter continued unabated. Battle Beast had entered the 41st millennium seeking a worthy death, but he had discovered something far more intoxicating. A galaxy that could provide a worthy, eternal life of slaughter. The legend of Thok was no longer a saga of a stranger. It was a new chapter in the red history of the stars. The arrival of Battle Beast in the Warhammer 40K universe was more than a mere collision of power. It was a revelation of what happens when a singular, untainted will meets a galaxy of infinite compromise. Thok did not seek to save the Imperium, nor did he wish to serve the Dark Gods. He moved through the stars as a force of nature, a living testament to the fact that in a universe of gods and monsters, the purest strength is the one that belongs to oneself. From the blood-stained vaults of Orestes to the frozen seas of Fenris, he proved that even the greatest legends of the 41st millennium could be made to bleed. Though Trazyn the Infinite believes he has secured a prize for his gallery, he has instead invited a hurricane into his house. The Battle Beast is not a trophy to be displayed, but a fire that consumes everything it touches. As the halls of Solemnace tremble under his fury, the galaxy continues its slow descent into madness, unaware that a new apex predator is carving its name into the void. The war for the soul of humanity goes on, but for Thok, the war is its own reward. He has found his worthy foes, and in the grim darkness of the far future, the hunt is only just beginning.